Hi, I'm Julie and this is the Crafted Closet. In today's video, I'm going to be showing how I made this little dress. The pattern is from Violet Field Threads, Isabel, and I used the sleeve ruffle and side ties. I did change up the back of the pattern. In the pattern, it has an overlapped button placket, and the skirt is not sewn together at the bottom. So I changed it to a zipper. I figured out on the pattern where the middle of the back would be, drew a line there, drew a line 1/2 inch to the outside of that to allow for the zipper. And so that's the changes I made to make it a zipper placket, or zipper instead of a button placket. And then all of the fabric is from Hawthorne Supply Co. It's from Shop Cabin, and the line is Frolic. This dress will be available in my shop, which is Wyatt and Pearl, and this one is a size 5. I can also make it in sizes 2 through 10. So I will link all of the information about the pattern, the fabric, and where you can buy this particular dress in the description below. I'm going to start by sewing the side panel top seam. I'm adding trim into this seam, so I'm going to place that trim just shy of 1/2 inch down from the top because I have a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to place the lining over that. And then I will sew those 3 pieces together. I will do the same with the other side. The lining up, I can see the edge of my trim, so I'm making sure I catch it. Now I'm going to sew my side ties together. Folding these pieces in half. Back stitch. And I will do the same with the other 3. I have all 4 of the side ties sewn together now. I'm going to sew together the sleeve ruffle main and lining. 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now I'm going to sew the bodice fronts to the backs. So right sides together, half-inch seam allowance. Should have been at a 2.5. back stitch. And I'm going to do the same with the lining pieces. So this bodice is fully lined. I did change the back. In the pattern, the back is an overlapped button placket, and I've changed it to be a zipper placket. Okay, now I will cut all this stuff apart and press. Turn and press all of the pieces out. So, I've trimmed all of my seam allowances to about 1/8 of an inch and clipped the corners at a 45°. I did the same on the sleeve ruffle pieces. Now we're going to turn everything and take it to the ironing board to press. For my side ties, I try and pull apart the fabric, create a little pocket there that I can put my skewer chopstick in, and then pull the fabric down onto that. Once you get it going, you can turn pretty quickly. Try and press out the corners while I have the chopstick in there, and I'll get them a little more perfect later, and then pull it all out. So I'll do the same with the other 3. To get the corners turned out perfectly, I stick a pin in and try and find that very corner stitch and pull out. The corner so that you have a nice square corner. You can do the same on this end. So I'll do the same for all the ties, and I've done the same for the sleeves. Now we're going to go press everything. To press, I go in first with my hand and kind of run my nail along that seam to finger press it out, because you want that stitch line to be at the very edge of your ruffle. And then I come back through with the iron. With the ties, you really can't get your finger in there, so I just roll with my fingers and make sure that that stitch line is on the very edge of the seam, and then come through and press. Sometimes if you have trouble getting it to turn all the way out, you can press it first and then make sure you're not going to burn yourself, but then roll the seam out after it has some steam and heat in it. And we're going to press open our seams on our front and back bodice, on the lining and the main. So open up that seam. I use my fingers to finger press it first and then press with the iron. Get that to where you can see it. So I open it up and then I take my nails and really press that and see how it's already staying open, and then I come in with the iron and just press. And for the side panel pieces, I just open them up. Actually, I'll press the lining away, and then I'll pull the trim piece out and press down. Now I'll press the rest of the ties and the other sleeve ruffle, and I'll meet you back at the sewing machine. I'm going to attach the bodice main and lining at the neckline. I generally pin at the shoulder seam to make sure that those seams line up. And then the rest I just match up as I go. I'm putting a zipper in here, so I'm going to leave about an inch unsewn at the back center seam. And then sew at my 1/2 inch seam allowance. Make sure I go back to my 2.5 millimeter stitch length. Back stitch here. I eyeball where you need to make this turn. If you're not as sure about being able to see that by eye, you can always mark your 1/2 inch seam allowance at the corners so that you can see it and then make that turn. And then again, I'll stop about an inch away from the back center. Now that I have the bodice and lining sewn together at the neck, I'm going to clip these seams. I don't want to trim here yet, but I do want to come in and leave about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance around the neckline. I don't have any sharp curves along here, so I'm not going to pink or cut notches in. It's not necessary with straight lines, but if you were working on a bodice with a curved neckline, you would probably need to either clip little triangles into the neckline or pink the edges to make sure that your curve comes out nicely. And then again on the back, I don't want to clip where I haven't sewn together yet. Now I'm going to clip into the corners as close as I can without clipping the stitch line, so that I can turn those out and get nice sharp corners. I'm actually going to switch to my little snips. Now we'll go press the bodice. We're going to flip everything right side out. And again, I'm going to run my fingernail along those stitch lines to finger press it first. You're looking at my wrist. Just lay that seam out as flat as I can and run my finger along it. So it's already sitting pretty flat. We're going to go in and roll with our fingers, or between our thumbs and fingers, and roll that seam out so that the stitches are right at the edge of the bodice. And then I will also press those little ends in that I didn't sew. Making sure I roll those seams all the way out and then press. You actually want the main bodice fabric to slightly roll over so that you won't see any of the lining on the outside of the dress. So if you see the tiniest bit of it from the inside, that's a good thing. So now we have that all pressed. Now would be the time, if you wanted to run top stitching along the edge of the sleeve ruffle, your side ties, the top of the side panel. I am going to go without it. I think it gives it a cleaner look, but either way looks nice. I have changed my stitch length to a 4, and I'm going to run a gathering stitch at about a 1/4 inch along my sleeve ruffles. I've got plenty of tails here so that I can pull together. Make sure I've got plenty of tails. And do the second one. Again, plenty of tails. Come up and cut. So I initially tried with just one row of gathering stitches and wasn't happy with the result. So I'm going to add a second row of gathering stitches to these ruffles. You want to, when you're doing your second row, try and make sure that your stitches are lining up so that when you gather it, it creates little columns with the gather. If your stitches are off from each other, their gathers just won't be as straight. Again, you want long tails. And I'm putting these gathering stitches about a 1/4 inch apart from each other. Other thing that's helpful that I forgot to do the first time is fold your ruffle in half and mark that center point. That center point is going to go at the neck seam on the shoulder seams on your bodice. All right, now we're going to insert the sleeve ruffles into the bodice. I've marked on my bodice up from the waist seam according to the pattern, both on the front and back. So we're going to gather our sleeve ruffle between these 2 pins. To gather the ruffle, you're going to grab the bobbin threads. You can hold the front threads and just pull the fabric along the bobbin threads to cause it to gather up. You want to gather evenly across the entire length of the sleeve ruffle. You can go to the other end also and grab those 2 bobbin threads and pull from that end as well. So by having 2 gathering threads, you get these nice little columns of gathers like you can see here, and it holds everything in place much better. If you just have one gathering thread, it's harder to keep it straight and it gets wonky easier. So now that we have that gathered, we are going to fit it in to the area that between these 2 pins. So I want the main fabric to be facing up when this is done. So I'm going to put right sides together. So I'll pin there. Pin here. Then I'm going to find my center snip. So that little V there, and line that up with the shoulder seam. I'm going to move these out a little bit. Trim off the threads. And spread the gathers evenly between those two pins. Once you're happy with how you have your gathers, you can pin them in place. So I try and pin about the middle between the two pins I already have in place, and then pin again between those two pins. And again between these two pins. If you're having trouble getting your gathers to sit straight, you can hold up here with your thumb and pull straight down, and it'll help kind of get them to lay flatter and straighter. Then I'll do the same for this side, and then we'll go to the machine and baste it in place. Now I've got the whole sleeve ruffle pinned in place. I'm going to baste it. Make sure your lining is out of the way. I should have said that when I was pinning it in, but make sure your lining is not in that seam. And we're just going to baste this in at 1/4 of an inch. And because we did the double line of gathering, the ruffles are staying in place very nicely. I'm sewing over my pins, and my machine can handle it. If your machine can't handle it, take them out as you go. I'm also not hitting them. If I thought I was going to hit the pin, I would remove it. So that's basted into place now. Take out my pins. You can take a look at how your sleeve ruffle's looking, and then we're going to flip it over. No, we're not. We're going to keep that side up, and we're going to take the lining and wrap it around the sleeve ruffle up to meet the main bodice fabric and enclose that ruffle. So I'm starting at the shoulder seam. I'm going to pin and make sure that those two seams match up. Then I'm going to come down to the waist seam, or what will be the waist seam. Make sure that lines up. Put a pin in. Kind of hold my gathering threads out of the way. Put a pin in. I'll just pin along the seam, making sure that the bulk of the material for this sleeve ruffle is pulled down out of the way so that we don't sew it into the shoulder seam. Make sure we line up the waist seam. And then we're going to sew this in at our 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm going to start just about 1/2 inch below and finish 1/2 inch past the sleeve ruffle. We're going to leave the rest of this open so that we can insert the side panels in a little bit. Back stitch so that that's locked in place. As you go, you can feel along and make sure that you're not getting any tucks or wrinkles that you're going to sew in. About 1/2 inch past that ruffle and then come back. Pull out the rest of our pins, and then we're going to pull from the front bodice side, and we'll pull that ruffle out, and it's going to pull our back bodice through the tube of the shoulder seam. So now our sleeve ruffle is inserted and the seam is fully enclosed. So I'll do the same on the other side and then we'll come back and do the side panels. Okay, now that we have our sleeve ruffles all in our bodice, we are going to attach the side panels and our ties. So with the ties, we want to insert them 3/4 of an inch up from the waist seam. Grab my pins. So 3/4 of an inch up, and I am putting the seam side down. So this is the fold side and the seam side's going down. And then I'm going to take our side panel, I'm going to trim the trim so that it matches up with the edges of the side panel. And then because I want my bodice or the lining on my bodice to fully enclose the skirt, I need the back lining or the lining and the main fabric to be separate at the waist seam. And if you install this panel how the instructions show you, then this is all one piece and you can't do the skirt separate. So I'm going to attach just the main side panel and the main front together and sew to about 1/2 inch. It's not super important how far you go, but I'm just going to sew between here and here. And then for the lining, I'm going to come around and do the same thing. Leaving unstitched up by this seam, but stitching it in place along there. And then once we have that inserted, then we'll finish closing in the seam all together. So it'll look something like this. So we'll sew along here, and that'll enclose that trim piece and the top of the side panel, while we leave the bottom of the side panel open. Okay. So we're going to sew at 1/2 inch, back stitch, making sure we're catching the side tie. We're just going to come up to about here and back stitch and cut, and then we're going to do the same with the lining. Now that both of those are sewn in, we can, so we've got our main, lining, and side panel. We've got the lining side panel and the main side panel sewn on to the lining and main. And now we're going to fold this up so that we can complete the rest of this seam. Back stitch, and then we'll back stitch where we finished sewing the side panels. So now our side panel, tie, and lining are all connected, and this part, the waist seam, is free. So we will do the same thing with the other 4 seams. Okay, I'm going to show the back from a slightly different angle just to see if you get a better view. So we've got the front attached. Now I'll take the back. So we have our side tie pinned in place. We're going to line that up. Sew at 1/2 inch. Do the same with the back. line up all of those seams, or the front and back seam. Make sure our trim is standing up. Start at the seam where we finished inserting the sleeve ruffle, back stitch, and then stitch down to your seam where we inserted the front and back side panel. And now that seam's complete, and I need to fix that, but you have your panel inserted. Everything's fully enclosed from the inside. So I'll fix that little stitch and then we'll work on the skirt. So here's our finished bodice. The side ties, we can tie those to see how it looks. So I find if I tie 90 degrees to the direction that I want the bow to go, then I end up with a straighter bow. There's my little... I realized this video is getting way too long, and so I'm going to do the skirt and zipper installation in the next video. Thank you for watching.